Alexander Hamilton letter to George Washington, September 9th, 1792. In 1792, Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton wrote to President George Washington. This was in the midst of the rise of political parties and the creation of Hamilton's financial plan. He wrote to Washington in response to a letter that Hamilton received 2 weeks earlier. Hamilton opens by writing, "I have the pleasure of your private letter of the 26th of August. The feelings and views which are manifest in that letter are such as I expected, and I sincerely regret the causes of the uneasy sensations you experience. It's my most anxious wish, as far as may depend upon me, to smooth the path of your administration." The letter that Washington had previously sent to Alexander Hamilton expressed Washington's views on political parties, and those views were such that political parties would bring turmoil and possibly the downfall of the country, the Union, and the Constitution. In these opening lines, Hamilton is expressing his similar view on political parties. However, this is despite the fact that Hamilton is the leader of the Federalist Party. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the Federalist Party and Democratic Republican Party, were both members of Washington's cabinet. Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, and Jefferson, the Secretary of State. With two high-ranking positions and both being in positions as leaders of two different and opposing political parties, caused problems in during Washington's administration. Continuing, Alexander Hamilton wrote to Washington, "And if any prospect shall be open of healing or terminating differences which exist, I shall most cheerfully embrace it, though I consider myself as the deeply injured party. And if your endeavors should prove unsuccessful, I do not hesitate to say that in my opinion the period is not remote when the public good will acquire substitutes for the differing members of your administration." Although Hamilton believed he was the party that was being attacked by Jefferson, both had gone back and forth in attacking the others and expressing their disapproval of the beliefs of the other. In 1793, Jefferson drafted a 10-point indictment of Hamilton's conduct of the Treasury in an effort to make Hamilton resign from office. When Jefferson's complaints were heard by Congress, Hamilton was viewed as not guilty. In response to this, Jefferson said, "A corrupt legislature has exonerated a corrupt Secretary of the Treasury." Jefferson believed that Hamilton's views on the Constitution and loose construction and the way Hamilton manipulated those views to allow for the National Bank an assumption. Jefferson believed that that was unconstitutional and made him corrupt. Democratic Republican National Gazette and Federalist Gazette of the United States constantly misrepresented the opposing views of the other party, and they would constantly libel the beliefs of the opposing party. When Hamilton wrote that he believed that when the public good will require substitutes for differing members of your administration, he was saying to Washington that for the general public, at some point, either Hamilton or Jefferson must be removed from office in order to retain the general welfare. In essence, Hamilton was telling Washington that you have to choose either Hamilton, or Jefferson. In continuing his letter to President George Washington, Alexander Hamilton writes, "I considered myself as compelled to this conduct by reasons public as well as personal, of the most cogent nature. I know that I have been an object of uniform opposition for Mr. Jefferson from the moment of his coming to the city of New York to enter upon his present office. Know from the most authentic sources that I have been frequent subject to the most unkind whispers and insinuations from the same quarter." Hamilton believed that Jefferson had been berating Hamilton and had been bad-mouthing him behind his back, and he had been bring strong opposition to the Federalist Party. Politically, Hamilton is expressing the belief shared by Washington that the factions that Jefferson, the faction that Jefferson has created in the Democratic Republican Party, is generally bad for the United States. However, personally, Alexander Hamilton is trying to defend himself and his beliefs against Jefferson, who is constantly attacking him. Elaborating on Jefferson's treatment towards Hamilton behind his back, on September 9th, 1792, Jefferson wrote to George Washington, writing, "I was duped into by the Secretary of the Treasury and made a tool for forwarding his schemes, not then sufficiently understood by me." In 1789, Hamilton began working on his Report of the Public Credit, which was his financial plan. Part of this financial plan included insumption and the National Bank and the excise tax. In 1790, Jefferson, Hamilton, and James Madison partook in the dinner table bargain. During this dinner table bargain, Hamilton agreed to allow the Southerners to move the capital of the United States to its current location in Washington, D.C., in exchange for legislative support on his financial plan. At the time, Madison and Jefferson believed that Hamilton was only wanted support for the first part of his financial plan, which was assumption. However, Hamilton eventually passed 3 parts to his financial plan, including the creation of a national bank. Jefferson and Madison were opposed to a national bank and felt duped by Hamilton because he was able to get it created. The financial plan strongly supported the Federalist view and not the Democratic-Republican views. Hamilton continues his letter by expressing his complaints of Jefferson, in which Jefferson is forming political parties in Congress, which was not approved of at the time. He also complained that Jefferson was using the National Gazette for purely political purposes, and that Jefferson took all measures to ensure that all plans produced by the Secretary of Treasury were not passed through Congress. Although these are true, that these complaints were true, Hamilton was very hypocritical, because he himself had created the Federalist Party in opposition to the Democratic-Republican Party, and Hamilton had created, with the help of John Finot, created the Gazette of the United States in opposition to Jefferson's National Gazette. Continuing in Hamilton's letter, he writes, "I can even assure you I was instrumental in preventing a very severe and systematic attack upon Mr. Jefferson by an association of 2 or 3 individuals in consequence of the persecution which he brought upon the Vice President by his indiscreet and light letter to the printer transmitting Paine's pamphlet." In May of 1791, Thomas Jefferson wrote to George Washington explaining the situation between himself and a printer. A printer had published a personal note written from Jefferson. This note attacked John Adams and attacked the views of Adams, which may have been libelous, but expressed that Adams supported the creation of the United States government into a British government. In response to Jefferson's actions, Hamilton says that he prevented 2 or 3 individuals from a systematic attack upon Jefferson, which could have been detrimental to his political figure. After sharing his intentions to be a silent sufferer to the attacks made upon him by Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton writes to Washington, "But when I no longer doubted that there was a formal party deliberately bent upon the subversion of measures which, in its consequence, would subvert the government, when I saw that the undoing of the funding system in particular was an avowed object of the party, and that all possible pains were taken to produce the effect by rendering odious to the body of the people. I considered it as a duty to endeavor to resist the torrent, and as an effectual means to this end to draw aside the veil from the principal actors. Hamilton is reiterating the idea that Jefferson created the Democratic Republican Party and used the National Gazette to attack Hamilton. Hamilton is expressing the view that the funding system, the financial plan, the creation of a national bank were all opposed by Jefferson purely. Hamilton is expressing the idea that the creation of the financial plan assumption, the national bank, and that all of these ideas of Hamilton's were being opposed purposely by the Democratic Republican Party and Jefferson. Hamilton's funding system was part of his report on the public credit. In this report on the public credit, Hamilton explains the idea of assumption. The idea of assumption stated that the national government would take on or in other words, assume the debt of all the states. This would strengthen the national government by giving them more power to try and raise those funds. And one of those ways was the excise tax. The idea of redemption, which was highly opposed by James Madison, who supported the idea of discrimination. Redemption said that all citizens in possession of government securities, war bonds from the Revolution, that these would be paid off in full by the government. Hamilton claims that Jefferson attacked these plans because of political beliefs is not entirely true. Jefferson had reason to oppose these taxes. Being a plantation owner from Virginia, he believed in an agrarian view and agrarian ideals. This meant that he valued agriculture as the primary part of the economy in America. Hamilton, on the other hand, who was a wealthy New York banker, believed that commerce, trade, and banking should be the strength of the economy. Hamilton's financial plan of assumption, redemption, and the national bank greatly strengthened the Federalist and Hamilton's views and weakened that of Jefferson's. The last part of Hamilton's report on the public credit is the creation of a national bank. The Bank of the United States would be able to give out loans and collect money and regulate the economy of the United States. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution expresses the delegated powers of Congress. Jefferson cited this section of the Constitution in opposition to the National Bank. Jefferson believed that the powers stated were the only powers delegated to Congress. However, this was the idea of strict construction. Hamilton believed in loose construction, and in 1791 he wrote his opinion on the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States. In this, he wrote that the Constitution has express powers and implied powers. The implied powers being those powers needed to carry out the express powers, such as delegated by the Elastic Clause. Hamilton believed that the National Bank fell under the implied powers of the Constitution and therefore was not unconstitutional as believed by Jefferson. Ultimately, in response to the attacks upon him made by Jefferson, Hamilton says that he won't respond and he won't make action against Jefferson. However, he may say it, but he doesn't believe it and he doesn't show it. His actions show that he supports Federalist Party and that he will continue to strongly support those beliefs over all others. Towards the end of his letter to George Washington, Alexander Hamilton directly responds to the letter Washington sent him on August 26th. Hamilton responds to Washington's invitation to go to Mount Vernon. Possibly this could be a political move, as Hamilton would be able to express to Washington his Federalist beliefs and would be able to express his opposition towards Jefferson and his support of his own financial plan and the National Bank. Before concluding his letter, Hamilton writes, "The subject mentioned in the postscript of your letter shall with great pleasure be carefully attended to." At the end of his letter, Washington wrote, "P.S. I pray you to note down whatever may occur to you, not only in your own department, but other matters also of general import that may be fit subjects for speech at the opening of the ensuing session." Basically, Washington is asking Hamilton to take down any note of things that happen and that to present these issues during the next session of Congress or next meeting between Washington and his cabinet members. It can be assumed that Hamilton will most likely express his disapproval of Jefferson's creation of a political party and the use of the National Gazette, and that he will also reference his own financial plan and national bank and bring support towards them. Throughout the entire letter, Hamilton is trying to sway Washington on his Federalist beliefs, and he's trying to show his opposition towards Jefferson and show to Washington why the Democratic Republican beliefs and their opposition to the National Bank and report on the public credit are incorrect.